agenda is to have Paul Heinen, who is our policy liaison for Wisconsin's Green Fire, as well as Scott Coenen, who's the executive director with Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum, to give us a little bit of a recap on the results of the election and kind of the implications as they see it for action around climate as well as renewable energy in the state of Wisconsin. So I will pass it to both of you to kick us off, and we have about 20 minutes to chat and then time for some Q&A before we get to our other agenda items.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Let me run through what happened on Tuesday night for what we know at this point, and then I'll introduce Scott, and then we can answer questions together. Let me start at the federal level. We won't talk a lot, I don't think, about that. But right now, it's hard to say exactly what has happened. We know that the Senate is at 48 apiece right now. We need 50 to be in the majority if you're the Democrats, because Kamala Harris then votes to break the tie. But both parties are trying to get to 50. And right now, it's going to be likely December, unless Arizona and Nevada come in both for the Democrats, until we know. Georgia will hold its runoff in December. So the Senate is still up in the air. The House appears, although it hasn't been called, but it appears to have gone to the Republicans. So it's switched over from the current Democratic majority to a Republican majority, possibly. Again, that hasn't been called, and that will also take some time. The last articles I was reading is we may know more by early next week. I mean, may know at least who's in the majority, but you're not going to know everything for a while. This is not all that unusual. I mean, for places like Arizona, you could send your mail-in ballot up to 8 o'clock on Tuesday night. So, you know, my check is in the mail. So that's what's going on at the federal level. Obviously, President Biden will remain president for 2 more years. At the state level, so starting at at least the U.S. Senate race, Ron Johnson has won again. He will start his 3rd term, beat Mandela Barnes. For governor, Tony Evers has won again, so he'll be in for another 4 more years, along with Sarah Rodriguez is the lieutenant governor. Josh Kaul, the current attorney general, won, so he will also be in for 4 more years. Doug LaFollette won, we think, pretty sure. So he will start his 450th term. Doug has been around for a long time. But he will remain Secretary of State. And we'll have a new treasurer in John Leiber, who is a Republican who won that seat, or that constitutional office. So that's kind of what happened at the state level for the major offices. The state Senate, the Republicans picked up seats in both the Senate and the Assembly. So the Senate is now 22 Republicans, 11 Democrats, because they picked up 1 seat there. In the Assembly, it is 61 or 64-35. So 64 Republicans and 35 Democrats. So that's the way it'll be for the next 2 years. The Democrats or the Republicans picked up a few in both houses. So you kind of have the same political lay of the land that we had last session. Although the Republicans can be very happy with the fact that they continue to pick up seats in the legislature. They did not get to 66, which would be 2/3 in the Assembly, which means that the governor's vetoes will likely continue to hold. You need 2/3 in both houses to override a governor's veto. And they do not have 2/3 in the Assembly. The Republicans currently don't have 2/3 in the Assembly. So we'll wait for, I'm not talking for Scott and I, but we'll wait for the caucuses to meet. Caucuses are the meetings of both parties. The parties get together and meet at the Capitol to discuss their leadership and discuss their committee chairs, the appointments of committee chairs. I'm sure there's a lot of talking going on right now between leadership and the various people that would like to be in the committee chairs. Well, maybe we could talk, Scott and I could talk a little bit about who we think I think Rob Coles will likely be back in the Senate. The Representative Kuglich, who had the Assembly Utilities Committee, didn't run again, so that seat is, that chairmanship is kind of open at this point. So there was still a ways to go until we can figure a lot of these things out. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, the election is done. You're not going to be getting much until next week when the presidential election starts. I'm joking, kind of, but because we seem to be in election time all the time. But it's over so far. So that's pretty much the lay of the land. I will gladly answer questions after Scott talks. But let me introduce Scott. I'm really happy to have him here today. Scott's the executive director of the Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum. It's a not-for-profit organization that he started in 2017. Scott worked at the Capitol before this for Senator Howard Marklein. He really is dedicated to educating and informing the conservative leaders on energy strategies, including emerging clean technologies. From my perspective, Scott is a change agent at the Capitol, has been since 2017. These are not issues, the energy and climate issues are not issues that the Republicans generally are on top of. They're just, that's more of a Democratic issue. And Scott has really worked hard to, well, as he says, educate the folks around the Capitol in why and what we need to do. So really happy to have you here, Scott. Thank you very much. Really gutsy of you to have that Packers banner behind you right now. And take it away, and then we can talk together, answer questions.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Paul. Thank you, Sarah. Nancy, thank you guys for tuning in, spending a little time. So I think as Paul kind of said, I worked in the Capitol for about 7 years. I ran some campaigns across the state, did that kind of thing. So election season and election time was always kind of come naturally to me a little bit. So I hope that this can be a little bit informative. I confess that just like everybody that initially registered and then maybe wasn't quite as interested in hearing our thoughts on this, it's kind of a status quo election to some degree, right? So maybe our discussion won't be quite as ground swelling or ground shaking, because the election really wasn't ground shaking, right, all that much. Which is is unusual, I guess, nowadays in the United States, where the pendulum swings back and forth so drastically. So I just wanted to, I'll share my screen with your guys' permission real quick. I have the ability to do that. I just put together a couple of things that will kind of characterize my thoughts on the election and maybe illustrate a little bit. First off, what I thought happened nationally here, some issues that drove people to the polls, what that looked like, its impact on energy policy and maybe even climate discussion a little bit for you guys. I have a second slide that'll come in and detail a little bit more at the state level, statewide level. And again, hopefully it'll pepper our conversation a little bit in Q&A with, what happened in the state of Wisconsin, trends, what happened across the state, that kind of thing. And then I do want to drill into a little bit more of what Paul said, what happened to the state legislature, because that's obviously, I think, the most important thing, period, for us here. So I hope if you guys will just bear with me for a second, I'm going to share my screen here for a second. I hope everybody can see this to some degree. Perfect. So this is a controversial opinion of mine, and I don't know how true it is anymore, but it continues to bear out in the numbers. What you're seeing on the side of the screen there is a Pew Research Center poll that they always put together, very comprehensive about voter attitudes and issues as they're rolling into the voting booth. And you can kind of see, the things that both sides care about, the things that one side cares about, the other doesn't, et cetera, that kind of stuff. The couple that I'd like to highlight on here, obviously economy, there are some weird issues in here that aren't typically very high on voters lists. The future of democracy in the country, that's a new one that is very rarely showing up. There are obviously some very relevant reasons for that in the last couple of years. But you can see the typical, right? The economy, education, healthcare, Crime is almost always on here somewhere. Abortion, gun policy, those are longstanding arguments we've been having for probably since the founding of the country, right? But there are a couple in here that I think are fairly unique that I'd like to highlight. Obviously, you see energy policy, very, very high, abnormally high on the list for voter interest rolling into the polls. And it's shared very uniquely. The intensity is shared by both Republicans and Democrats, both concerned about energy policy or list energy as a concern when they were rolling into the voting booth. That is, again, very, very, very unusual. Now, we can drill into this a little bit, and I'd love to get into a discussion with you all, because I think energy policy, Republicans and Democrats are both concerned about it. I think they're probably concerned for different reasons, right? Or maybe there are some shared reasons that we're concerned on. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'll highlight that it's very, very unique to have voters focused on energy policy in this kind of way, in this intense way and broad way. You'll see it further down the line, but climate change is listed there, but it is listed with a dramatic partisan split, right? So I've always, again, this is controversial. It's maybe not shared by everybody. The opinion isn't shared by everybody, but Republicans don't care about climate change. It's not a motivating factor for your average Republican voter. Maybe you can caveat that with younger voters are more concerned, or, you know, I don't know. It's possible, but just given the numbers that continue to bear out every election cycle, every poll, we can claim otherwise, but I am going to continue to say that conservative voters in the base of the Republican Party is just not motivated by climate change. They aren't. There is an intensity gap there that is as wide as the Grand Canyon, period. So I will fast forward a little bit here to what happened in the state of Wisconsin. These are statewide numbers for governor from a comparison from 2018 to 2022 here in the last election. You'll see each county, the red counties got redder, and blue counties voted bluer. So you can see the change that's happening in the state of Wisconsin. I'll take this from a conservative or Republican approach. Our problem winning top of the ticket is very, very simple. We hemorrhage votes in Dane County, and we hemorrhage votes in Milwaukee County, and we're not making those votes up as much as we used to in Waukesha and Ozaukee County, period. Very, very populous counties, but Waukesha County and Ozaukee County are shifting blue at a very rapid rate since 2016. We can again get into the reasons for that, but at the top of the ticket, that is very, very significant. And I would go so far as to say it's one of the reasons that Governor Evers is reelected and will be, you know, sitting in the governor's mansion for another 4 years. So there's some weird things happening statewide, but Republicans continue to drive up their rural and outstate vote share. I don't know how much longer they can continue to do this, because some of these counties are voting 70-30 Republican at this point. So there's not a whole lot more you can drive of outstate vote for the Republican Party. So, you know, at the top of the ticket, folks, you know, on at least on my side of the aisle, we really need somebody who can try and appeal more to suburban and urban voters, period. And I don't know what that voter profile looks like necessarily. We talk a lot about college educated women, right? They've shifted left drastically in the last few years. I don't know exactly, but I bring that up only because I think, and I personally have believed for quite a few years now, that clean energy and a softer stance on renewable and clean energy could be an opening to some of those voters who are largely pro clean energy and largely pro renewable energy. But Republicans are having a very, very difficult time connecting with them. So there are a lot of probably other reasons for that, but I bring that up specifically because it's important to me, and I think it's a talking point that we can use with conservatives on this, and it's a talking point that rings true. So I'll move on just real quick and zoom in on what happened at the state legislature here, because again, that's the most important thing for policy developments going forward in the state of Wisconsin. The state legislature is what matters to us, I think, at this point. As Paul said, Senate looks like 22 Republicans and 11 Democrats. That's a veto-proof majority. And that is a veto-proof majority that is fairly durable. The Senate is not it's not a battleground necessarily in the next 2 years or in the next 4 years. Senators are fairly locked in a lot in their districts. So that's going to be difficult to roll back from the state Democratic Party's perspective. In the Assembly, there's more play, but I have to be honest with everybody here. The Assembly GOP almost ran the table on things to a veto-proof majority. They're very, very close. They're at 64. You need to get to 66, as Paul said, for a veto-proof majority. Potential R pickups in the next few years, or in 2 years, even the next 2-year cycle. Assembly District 94 out in La Crosse, that was a 2-point win for Democrats, and candidly, the Democrat representative there, Representative Steve Doyle, is a longtime incumbent. So that may very well be a seat that's ready to flip in the next 2 years, especially given that previous slide with voters moving further red in a lot of those outstate and western Wisconsin districts. And then Oshkosh is a seat that hasn't typically been in play, but Oshkosh and the surrounding area is also starting to trend right a little bit. That was an 8-point win for the Democrats. So that 66th seat is maybe not likely, but it's awfully close. It's awfully close. And I can see, I had listed here, there are probably 3 potential Democrat pickups in the next 2 years that might negate that 64, 65, 66 seat. But I have to be honest with everybody that that's really, really close. Like, it's very, very close. We are not far away from the Wisconsin state GOP having veto-proof majorities in both houses. We are not far away from that. And frankly, we would not be the only Midwestern state that has that feature. Iowa is trending that direction. Indiana's already there. Ohio has been there for a while. Like, these are states that have moved in that direction pretty decisively, and they have very similar political dynamics to what's happening in Wisconsin right now. So my main takeaway, and I'd love to get into some Q&A on this, it's the same takeaway I had after the 2020 election. We live in a divided country, in a divided region, in a divided state. This is as purple as it gets in the state of Wisconsin. We have got to talk to people that don't agree with us on this stuff, on energy policy or climate change or whatever. If you're not spending some time talking to people that don't agree with you, you're not making any progress on the issue. So that's my main takeaway for things. And I'll stop sharing my screen here and hopefully just get into some productive discussion in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Paul and Scott. That was great. Really like that overview too, Scott. So we'd like to just open up the call here for folks that have questions. What makes it easier is if you can use the raise hand feature, which you can find in the little reactions button at the bottom. It's a little smiley face with a plus. You can raise your hand to ask a question, and then we can ask you to unmute and ask your question. Or if you'd like to enter a question in the chat, we can read that out loud. So looks like Paul's up first. Paul, go ahead.
Scott, bills take a while, and you've been working on a lot of energy issues for the last 7 years. Anything this session that you're kind of hopeful for? EVs or diversified or anything in particular that you think this is a session I think that we're going to get over the hump on this one?
Yeah, there are always a couple of issues that come up surprise, right? So I have that caveat for things, but I wrote down before we started our discussion here, our priorities as an organization. And I guess I maybe should have started with this, folks. My organization, Paul touched on it for a second, but what we do entirely is try to figure out an approach on clean energy from a conservative market perspective, right? Like I want pro clean energy policy, but I want to approach that from a conservative perspective and figure out how to do it. So last session was the first time that I think we had real concrete movement and success on things. But my priority, they haven't changed a lot. We have a real shot at introducing a community solar bill and community solar market into the state of Wisconsin. That is eminently achievable. It's eminently doable. There will also be a lot of action on third-party financing of solar panels on homes and businesses. That whether that action happens at the Public Service Commission, in the courts, or it will also happen at the legislature. There are a number of bills related to electric vehicles that I think also have a very, very good shot at making their way across. When I say across, I mean literally starting in the Republican legislature and migrating their way across the aisle to a signature for Governor Evers. It's a hard line to walk, right? It's a very, very thin line that you have to walk to make that stuff happen. But community solar, third-party financing of distributed solar, and there are a number of, like I said, electric vehicle things that I think this stuff it's doable and it's achievable.
Okay.
Another one real quick, Scott, the Biden money, federal money coming in over the next 4 years, lots of renewable energy and climate change money. Are you tapping into that?
Not me personally, but no,
Sorry.
no, I wish it was. No, I mean, fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of the planning, the facilitating, what happens with those federal dollars takes place at the administration, right? At the administration level, and takes place at the agency level, right? So I think my job, I think, there's going to be some oversight, from the Republican legislature, and there should be oversight of that money, right? I think, our job is to make sure that that's constructive oversight, and that, the dollars we're not actively pushing dollars and opportunity away. But I think there's an opportunity for us to have constructive oversight, period. But make sure that those funds are spent and spent in a good way in the state. So that engenders some sort of cooperation and participation between the legislature and the administration. It's hard to do, but it is something that is doable.
Thanks.
So it looks like Kelly had her hand raised next. Kelly, if you'd like to unmute. Oh, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Right. Scott, as somebody who regularly talks with people who don't seem to care a lot about climate change, what arguments or what discussion points would you say we should be using for those people or people that are kind of like on the fence about it? And what things don't work for people who don't seem to care about climate change? I mean, obviously the arguments that a lot of us have been using haven't been working.
Yeah, again, this is just me, and it's not shared by everyone. But I don't go into a lot of my audiences and bring climate change up at all, right? I don't bring it up at all because it sucks the room out of the air out of the room, and then the discussion becomes about climate change as opposed to energy and technology and other things, right? So I'm always approaching solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, whatever it might be. I'm approaching the issue as if it's good old fashioned American innovation, right? I mean, these are technologies and they are tools like anything else. Use them to your advantage. And then you start to get into the discussion of use them to your advantage, and also state governments and the outdated and horrible 150-year-old laws that we have in this state sometimes prevent you from being able to use these technologies to your advantage. That's a hell of a conservative argument, Kelly. I mean, that drives home to conservatives, right? Who dislike overburdensome regulation and do not like state government telling them what they can and cannot do. So those arguments are there, they're out there. I've really been leading with, and I'll go back to energy policy being so high for Republicans and Democrats. There's obviously a national security issue here that everybody is talking about and needs to continue to talk about, but we need to apply that national security concern to renewables, right? It's something like, we're very good at doing that with fossil fuels, right? Like natural gas, they're running out of it in Europe. We have to produce more here in the country to ship to Europe. So hopefully they don't freeze to death, right? Like we're in a fight with Russia, over Eastern Europe. Really, really good at applying those to fossil fuels, but then flip that around and apply it to solar. We don't need to be burning $9 natural gas, exorbitantly expensive natural gas in the state of Wisconsin when it's 95 degrees and sunny out to run our air conditioners, because we can have solar panels do that instead. And then we can send that natural gas, sell it to Europe or sell it to Asia, right? So there are national security implications that I don't think folks in the renewable energy industry apply those national security interests very well to this issue. And I don't know that our advocates do that very well either, but I really believe that the energy policy issue is high on the list, particularly for Republicans from a national security perspective. And so you gotta hit on that.
So it looks like Nancy had her hand up next, and then I've got a couple of questions in the chat we can go to.
Thanks, Sarah. Quick question for Paul about the allocation of the Biden money. Will that take place by Congress? So if it's already allocated.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a question about whether or not if the Republicans get a majority in the Senate, so they'd have both houses, if they would try in some way to take that back, or in some way, and there's other ways you could fool around with it. But right now that money was passed in a federal law, that Joe Biden administration sends that money to the states, and the states then spend that money. There is no oversight. Now, having said that, there's something called the state budget. That's big time oversight. So if the Republican Party wants to send a message to Tony or do something about his agency's budgets, that's a possible way they can do it. But literally, no, they can't touch it. That money goes from the governor to the DNR, to AG, to the Public Service Commission, or whatever, for those things. So, and that's why we do have some influence in that. We do, talk to agency staff quite a bit. Scott, I even think next session talking to you too about, hey, what's some ideas about things that we can work with you and, the more conservative elements in the legislature about.
Nancy, in my opinion, Paul, if you wouldn't mind me just adding on for a second, everything that I've seen from the federal law passed indicates that a lot of the funds and a lot of the dollars are really prescriptive. I mean, they're very prescriptive. If you want to spend the money, you are spending it on X, Y, and Z, right? Like, so there again, there is oversight, and obviously there's some of that to the state level, but a lot of it is fairly prescriptive. So
yeah, so they're not going to be grant programs. It's just going to flow out based on formulas or something.
Yeah, most of it.
Okay.
Well,
Because I've noticed with grant programs, Wisconsin is pretty poor at engaging in them. I did recently see where a lot of money came to rural school districts in Wisconsin for EVs. They actually requested money, but that's highly unusual and it's frustrating to see grant program after grant program. So it would be nice if it just shows up on our doorstep.
Yep. It makes it easier. There's no doubt.
Thanks.
So I'm going to go to a question from Bill Fisher here, and he asks, can energy bills move from the Democratic to the Republican side, not just the other way? And Bill, if you want to unmute to elaborate on your question, you're welcome to do that.
Well, this is just in response to what Scott was talking about, that maybe the likelihood of a bill having success seems to, because Republicans are in the majority, that it's got to originate with them. But why isn't the opposite true if the bill has, support on both sides? It's just a procedural question, I suppose.
Go ahead, Scott.
yeah, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in our current environment, and in our polarized politics. Yeah.
Okay.
Not commonplace, I guess. So.
Okay.
We can jump to Sandy's question here. She has a question about electric vehicles and where's the forethought or planning for infrastructure? Plug-in stations are easy. What about the weight issue for Wisconsin roads, overpasses, bridges, etc.? Civil engineers realize that in many ways the cart is ahead of the horse on this issue. Any action here? And Sandy, you're welcome to unmute too if you'd like to elaborate more on your question. I don't know if Paul or Scott or anyone else has a comment related to EVs.
I raise that question because civil engineers that are state employees and district employees, northern, northeastern, and so forth, are raising the weight issue.
Sandy, I would imagine the weight issue is probably falling more on larger, not necessarily passenger electric vehicles, although I understand they are heavier than your typical internal combustion engine vehicle. But I'd imagine maybe that concern is coming with electrified semis and things like that, because I don't know, I'll admit off the top of my head what an electric semi weighs, but I would imagine it would be fairly significant. I hadn't heard that before, Sandy, so I'll ask the question back and return to you. Is that kind of the context, or are people still concerned about passenger EVs in that weight as well?
I've heard both. Load up some of our overpasses with electric semis and they will collapse. And I've heard local bridges, county bridges, the smaller bridges in our more rural areas, put 2 or 3 electric vehicles, cars, maybe a couple cars and a truck on, an Amazon truck on it, they'll go down too.
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard it too, Scott. Interesting. Gary Radloff, have you heard that as an issue?
I would just add to that question that, the DOT establishes weight limits on all bridges, and any vehicle manufacturer or operator needs to be cognizant of those limits. So it may be the manufacturers will run up against those limits as they start thinking about larger vehicles that are EV. But you cannot legally operate an overweight vehicle on a bridge or during certain times of year on Wisconsin roads.
I've always kind of been of the opinion, and this is not a straight answer to you, Sandy, and we're talking a little bit more than just politics on this, but I have always been of the opinion that some of these problems in the first or second generation of whatever electric vehicle you're talking about probably get solved, right? As you increase battery density, you need less battery material, right? And so you're increasing battery density by X amount every single iteration of electric vehicle. And I just read a news article the other day that there's a Chinese battery manufacturer that came out with their 3rd generation battery. They think they have a typical mileage of 750 miles on it, on a full charge, which you're at your mileage goal then, right? You don't need to go much further than that. So then you get to the point where if you can add more energy density, you may get to a point where you need less materials, and you start to butt that weight issue down a little bit more. Although I'll admit I'm no expert on that stuff. But I've always kind of been of the opinion that there are probably there are way smarter folks than me that I think are probably aware of that issue at some point up that chain, right? For EVs. And I know you can only solve so many issues and so many problems, X, Y, and Z, but I hope that that's something that becomes less of a problem, as you start to ramp that technology up and improve on it a little bit. But that's just a hope and not really an answer.
Certainly the better batteries or better capability of batteries will come along, but that will have to be weighed against the weight of the vehicle or the size of the vehicle too, whether you're driving a VW or whether you're driving Escalade.
Mm-hmm.
I have the other concern I brought up is what action do you see for safe mining? If we're going to live in an IT world and drive these kind of vehicles and have Zoom calls, obviously we need to be mining some of the materials. And we've seen what has happened in Wisconsin in the past with applications that have not been fulfilled. And I don't recall the name, Frank might know, but there was a fellow on a Zoom out of Minnesota, but he was retired Wisconsin DNR, who said that the application for the Ladysmith mine was absolutely false from the beginning, but yet it was accepted, but he rejected it and got almost run off out the door of the DNR.
I can tell you that statement is 100% correct.
Scott, there are issues,
Are you the man?
the new kinds of things that need to be mined, right? For some of the renewables. You probably know, what are companies doing? I assume they're looking for trying to get those materials up and running so that you can make the renewable things, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine it's probably an issue that you guys struggle with to some degree, right? You know, we have a choice to make, and this is actually one of the few bright spots that I saw with the Inflation Reduction Act, or whatever you want to call it at the federal level. Like, tax subsidies for electric vehicles in the United States are now geared specifically at how much of that vehicle is manufactured in our country and where those sources come from, right? Which, you know, it's a little bit protectionist. I'm kind of a free trader, but I can understand the reasons for that you know, that dynamic. I mean, we have a kind of clear choice to make. We can either source this stuff from South America, China, you know, Southeast Asia, or, you know, we can source it from more responsible places. And you know, what that responsibility looks like, I don't know. I don't have a lot of belief that we can do that in the United States, you know, just because we run into a lot of problems, not just economic problems, but also, you know, people in general don't like mines, you know, sited in their backyard, and it's understandable, right? And you kind of run into that problem as well. So I imagine that, you know, your group might struggle a little bit with that, because, you know, rare earth mining is intensive, and it is environmentally, I don't care how much you clean the process up. Everything that I've read about the process indicates that it takes a toll on the land. Like, it does, you know, it is a very industrially intensive process. So there are no easy answers to that. I would rather we do it here than somewhere else. But I also, you know, recognize that there are unique challenges to doing it here.
Yeah. Well, if there's not another question, we have a number of comments here in the chat. But I think, Nancy, should we move on to the next part of our updates?
Sure,
Just checking if there are any other questions for Paul.
Excuse me, I have a question. I just can't find it.
Sure. Oh, yeah, please.
All right, just a couple of comments. I appreciate the discussion on the trucks, heavy trucks, but the cars got lumped into this as well for the bridges and concerns about the weight. And electric cars really don't weigh much more, in fact, about the same as a lot of mid-size and larger SUVs and pickup trucks. So, and I've never heard anybody being very worried if people buy a lot, you know, full size or mid-size SUVs, that bridges are going to start collapsing. So at least from a passenger car standpoint, this is a non-issue. With trucks, I believe that, yeah, that could be an issue. The other comment I would have is regarding rare earth elements mining. Absolutely true that it's very damaging environmentally. However, for conventional cars, aluminum mining, smelting, mining coal is not exactly a walk in the park either. So while these are problems, the alternative technologies that we're using today have some of those same problems in slightly different ways, but still serious problems. If you've ever been in an area like Sudbury that's had aluminum smelters, it can be a pretty nasty landscape. Yeah. There's no free lunch, unfortunately.
I see, and I agree entirely, right? Like, there are trade-offs with everything, right? I'm really cognizant of the fact that you don't. One of the reasons that I really support electrified transportation and the uptake of these technologies, because I'm beyond tired of living in a world that is powered and dominated by the global oil economy. I am beyond tired of that, right? It worked for the United States of America at a certain point. It was geopolitically advantageous for us. It is no longer geopolitically advantageous for the United States or for the world economy to run on oil. Just isn't. We're getting bowled over, and we've been getting bowled over for 50 years now. So to me, you know, that again, to go back to the national security argument, that makes all the sense in the world to electrify transportation as much as possible, blow a hole in world oil demand, and never have to deal with OPEC ever again, right? Or any of those countries that we don't particularly share value with, and stop enriching them, period, right? But at the same time, the flip of the coin is we don't necessarily also then want to become reliable on a foreign adversary or any other foreign country for a flow of critical minerals that we need to put into batteries also, right? So there's a national security exposure to that as well. So I don't know, I wish we had more honest conversations at the federal level about some of this stuff, because trade-offs are all over the place, everywhere on this stuff. And I feel like we don't sometimes, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Paul, for coming on and providing us your insights, and a lot to think about. So we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, Scott, thank you very much. You can certainly stay on and listen if you want, but you probably may have some other things to do. So thanks for having us, Nancy and Sarah.
Thanks
Absolutely.
for
guys,
coming. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I would say I find it rude to leave sometimes, because I am interested in some other things that you guys are working on, obviously. I went up to the PFAS presentation up in Wausau over this summer and found it absolutely enlightening. Really, really enjoyed it very, very much. So I appreciate everything that your guys' group does, that you guys work on. But I have to run home and close my windows before it becomes 35 degrees out again tonight. So I appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
Thanks,
a lot,
Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to pass it over to you, Nancy.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So we thought that it would be helpful to run through a few of the items that we've been working on since we last met. Just for those that perhaps haven't participated in our work group meetings before, we're trying to hold work group gatherings such as this about quarterly, and just to provide updates. I think that it's important to note too that if you we'll have open mic time. So if you have ideas to share or suggestions, once Sarah and I do the updates, we have space for you to converse too. We won't have time to do breakout sessions this round though. And if you have interest in being more involved with any of the work group activities, please do let us know. You're not limited to participation just with these quarterly meetings. So Sarah and I and a couple other folks from Green Fire attended the Climate Fast Forward conference that I don't know if this is the third semi-annual with COVID in between, second meeting. Okay. So that's hosted by Wisconsin Academy, and it's been held down at Monona Terrace in Madison both times. Wisconsin Academy tends to hold meetings that kind of set the stage and then break people up into individual groups where you do lots of idea generation and brainstorming and that sort of thing. And then they usually come up with some sort of report or guidance. They synthesize the information. It wasn't clear what or when that might occur with the information that was gathered with Climate Fast Forward. Anyway, it occurred last month. They broke folks into groups. Sarah participated in Climate Justice and Community Resilience group. There was a Green Jobs and the New Economy group. I participated in the Natural and Working Landscapes group. And then there was also Built Environment and Traditional Perspective on the Environment group. So we spend a lot of time conjuring up ideas, brainstorming how the idea could actually get off the ground, voting on ideas and to prioritize them and that sort of thing. So I guess we all have to stay tuned to find out, like, now what? with all of that information. So we will let you know when we find out. One of the things that came out of this gathering, that comes out of many of these gatherings, is opportunities to network and meet others that are working in the climate change space. There were, I don't know, 200, 300 people there. It was a large number of individuals and organization representation. Sarah and I both happened to bump into people that are involved in the Wisconsin Climate Table. So this is an organization that Fred was familiar with. I hadn't heard of. I don't know about Sarah, but Sarah, do you want to kind of provide a brief on where we're at with Climate Table?
Yeah, so Nancy and I heard about this thing called the Climate Table, which I hadn't heard about, but it's basically a network of groups across Wisconsin that have interest in working together on climate solutions. This is a internal group, and so it's not public facing, which may be one of the reasons why our organization didn't hear about it. But as of today, we are now members of this thing called the Climate Table. Their whole effort is supported by REAMP. If you've heard of them, they're a Midwest network that has the shared goal of achieving 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050. So they're working across like the Midwestern states. And the whole like goal of the group is really to like foster strategic collaborations and communications between their members. They don't take policy positions, but we were made aware of 2 campaigns that they're working on. One is a community commitments campaign. And if it looks like I'm looking over at other screen, it's because I have my notes here about these 2 different campaigns. But this particular community commitments campaign is looking to partner with local governments that are doing climate action planning. And right now they're pulling together an equity tool for local planning. And this is to ensure that equity is at the center of those local plans, which often, you know, local governments really don't have the tools or know how to do that. So that's an interesting initiative that we'll find out more about and can share at some point. And then they're also helping to advance the clean energy plan that's been advanced by the Evers administration, and helping to kind of boost engagement and tracking the federal funding as well from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So they're tracking those things and making sure that communities can be prepared to apply for those funds. So pretty cool, a new initiative and coalition to be part of, and we're just getting started with them. So more to come. I'll pass it back to Nancy to provide the last little update from our group.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So we are excited to be working with a UW-Madison fellow who is helping us put together 1 or 2 fact sheets related to mid or larger scale solar. So Connor, are you on the call at all? Not sure if he was going to be able to join us.
I'm not sure I saw Connor join.
Okay.
Mid-meeting people and I didn't see him.
Okay, that's fine. I was going to have him wave if he is on the call. At any rate, Sarah and I have been meeting with him every couple weeks to keep him on track. His first fact sheet is focused primarily on the different type of ground cover options that are available to put below solar developments. So that could range from, depending on where you are in the country, concrete bases, you can have gravel, you can have just mowed grass, you can have pollinator habitat and prairie plantings, or you could have agriculture is the basic range, right? And so Connor is going to look at pros and cons of all these different options based on his literature review, and then put together a handy fact sheet with the intent of, you know, if someone wants to put whatever 40 acres into solar, what kind of options can they think about? So those folks can use these fact sheets. All the way to a larger scale solar development is being proposed in an area, and community members want to know, like, what are the options, right? So that's the intent behind these. We're hoping, Connor's hoping to have his first fact sheet or two out towards the beginning of the year. So look for that. We have a number of people from Extension and UW and that have worked under these in these operations that are willing to provide review for Connor's outputs and that sort of thing. So I think that's that. Those are the majority of the things we're working on. As Sarah mentioned, Green Fire is also working on their strategic work plan for the coming year. And so a component of that will be related to climate change and may overlap with some of the other work groups, right? So climate change is affecting our wildlife and forests and that sort of thing. So we're not sure how it'll all come together, but we will definitely share that with everyone at our next quarterly meeting.
Yeah, and just to kind of elaborate a little bit on that too, we're really going to be drilling down on kind of the key focus areas for Green Fire to tackle when it comes to climate science and solutions and resilience. I mean, it's such a huge dynamic space that we will of course share that back to you and kind of the more concrete things that we'll be working on. Fred, did you want to mention anything about the green tier involvement? Nancy, I know you and I didn't chat about it, but was one other way that we're working in the climate space with the DNR.
Yeah, one other just iron we have in the fire is, I think about 6 months ago, we were approached by the folks running the Wisconsin DNR's Green Tier program. And for those of you who are familiar with it, that's a program that really seeks to, inspire or incentivize voluntary actions by the regulated community that can bring standards and environmental outcomes over and above what existing standards are. So the program is really designed to be a voluntary complementary program that would help business take its own initiative to, meet and exceed environmental quality standards. And one of the programs within Green Tier is what's called the Charter Program, within which companies within a given business sector might come together and draft their own charter that would basically represent standard procedures or commitments that folks within that sector would make collectively around their business operations. And that's got potential to be a very powerful tool. And so just this last year, the DNR folks have determined they want to create a climate charter. And this year has been the sort of scoping year for that effort, where they have invited members of the business community along with NGOs to help begin to visualize what a charter might look like. And Green Fire is one of the advisory members on their committee to form that. And if we choose to stay involved, we could become I can't remember the term, but an NGO partner within the climate charter. So we're engaged in that discussion. Potentially there's a lot of opportunity there to help steer some more rigorous guidance around what businesses would do that would comply with the requirements of a charter. But we also have our eyes wide open that it's very possible that this plane just doesn't fly very high, whether there's significant critical mass of business engagement and whether the department's really willing to hold for some standards that are meaningful is an open question. But we're part of that discussion right now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fred.
Yep.
Looks like Bob Gerda has a question. I think he's on the phone. Bob, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the what Nancy was talking about with the, the fellow and the ground cover options for solar fields. I'm wondering if what's we know about wildlife effects depending, and particularly depending on the size of the solar field.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've given a lot of thought to a lot of times fencing is required around these developments for protection of people, exclusion of people, but it also excludes animals. And there are options for different size fencing grids and different requirements for fencing from the ground height and that sort of thing. And that is one of the fact sheets that I hope we can put together, but I think that will be, beyond, we'll have to figure out how to get that done after Connor is done, because I think it's too much. He's gathering and setting aside literature that he comes across related to that. And I would love to work with the wildlife work group or some of the folks that are interested in that topic to really explore how to minimize impacts to wildlife from things like larger scale solar.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. So we have about 10 minutes left in our call for anyone to provide an update, an announcement, things that you're working on that you'd like to share with the larger group, or ask a question or make a comment. This is just really open for anyone to chime in, and then we'll close out the call. So yeah, I wanted to thank everybody for attending, and yeah, we'll just open the floor here. And again, if you want to raise your hand or just wave at us, we will allow you to unmute. Yeah, Bruce, I see your hand raised.
Will the recording of this meeting be available to us?
Yes, we can make it available. I believe that Jenny has been recording it, so we'll get it downloaded and we can put it back to all the attendees or those who that registered who perhaps couldn't make it. So yeah, great question.
Okay, thank you.
If there is nothing from the rest of the oh, Don's raising his hand. Don.
So I noticed that you did not review the strategic program priorities, specifically number 1 being climate science, climate resilience, and climate solutions. But in that, a focus area is conducting community-based climate risk assessments and climate adaptation planning. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to broaden that and to reach out and at least monitor, at least, become aware of all of the communities in Wisconsin that are already in, both community organizations and municipal officials who are already involved in planning how to reduce local emissions. They're considering resilience planning. They're designating resilience officials on their staffs. There's a lot of activity going on. And I think that's an opportunity for Greenfire to add some expertise if questions come up, but we're not really kind of monitoring that activity now or kind of telling them of our availability. And one of the more active regions is the Fox Valley, where there are League of Women Voters groups, but also a lot of municipalities that have already started out on their own to do climate change planning. So I just wanted to toss that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Don. Where I see challenges with that is kind of based on what Scott was mentioning. So many counties are embedding climate resilience strategies, but they're not waving it under a climate change flag at all because it can't be talked about in their county as such, right? So it's emergency planning or,
Sure.
you know, there's all kinds of things going on, but that might preclude an easy acquisition of monitoring those sorts of things. That said, somehow in different ways, the word has gotten out that that Green Fire does assessments and can provide input, mainly because of the Monroe County project. A lot of people or municipalities are aware of that. And some have approached Green Fire about doing similar or some type of assessment, but they're all in different stages and nothing has gelled up to my knowledge. I don't know if Sarah or Fred wants to weigh in on that.
Well, we're having a couple of conversations right now with other counties who have an interest. But I agree to your point, Nancy. It's a complex, kind of messy space right now, the climate adaptation planning space, and it's being done at lots of different levels with different frameworks. And one of the reasons we wanted to identify program priorities in our strategic planning was that so we can be more intentional about honestly looking for the resources it would take to be able to even take on what you described, Don. So I think our involvement with the climate table and with Sarah's leadership should give us a better read on what other statewide actors are doing and help clarify what our niche can be. And then we got to go look for funding to take on any significant project opportunity.
Yeah, and just to help clarify for folks, what Don was referring to that we didn't go into detail tonight on is the program priorities across our organization related to different themes and, you know, harnessing the expertise of our subject matter experts. We're still in that sort of strategic planning phase where we're asking our science council, which constitutes our leadership, to help us basically nail those down and identify the focus areas. So it's not quite ready to be shared yet, and we didn't want to go into detail because it would have sucked up a lot of this call, which I really think that the commentary from Scott and Paul was really helpful and useful to think about. But thank you for that question, Don. I think it's a really good one, and we'll talk about it next week during or 2 weeks from now during that call for sure. I see a question here about thinking about plastics and how plastic production and disposal are contributing to climate change. It was a question from Leah. And Leah, that's not really something we've considered, but I think it's definitely, you know, an important one to think about in the kind of whole sphere of how it is that we are operating on the planet. And then a couple of notes here about the Conference of Parties 27. Thanks for sharing out those links. Any other comments, questions before we close out the call?
I guess I'll mention that I'm trying to post this at the same time, but the White House just released a roadmap for nature-based solutions, which I feel is really relevant to our group and members of our group, and that was released also for the Conference of Parties. So I'll place that link into the chat. I also placed one in that the White House put together that is an overview of climate actions at the federal level. They're really interesting reads in their briefings. So if you're not interested in digging deeper, you can still get the gist, but they do contain links. So if you want to dig deeper, it's pretty easy to do. So.
Hey, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to finish on just a really high note. I think I talked a little bit with Scott about it. There's a lot of money coming into Wisconsin, as it is all the other states, paradigm shifting amounts of money for energy and climate change. And we have not even begun to tap them yet.
Yep.
Scott wouldn't be involved in those kind of issues unless he wanted to work with the DNR on trying to help figure out best places for that money to go. And we are uniquely positioned to be able to help to do that. And what's particularly fun about this is you're not dealing with any of the partisan politics. Tony Evers will say who gets the money, and then those agencies, and particularly DNR, which we work very closely with. Some of us actually work there as I'm looking around this room. And we can be very helpful in doing that. We have 5 years worth of funding. I don't think that could change. The bill is passed, it is a law. And if, they try to unchange it, or if they try to change it, Joe Biden can veto it. So I'm really excited about that. The state legislature is pretty much, as Scott was saying, the same old, same old. Federal government is not. And the federal government, I've in my 40 plus years of working in government, there's never been anything like this. Maybe the safe drinking water programs is probably the closest thing, and they pale in comparison to the amounts of money coming to Wisconsin. So we're going to have a lot of fun in the next 4 years solving problems, because there's money there to solve problems. Not $1 million to throw at a $200 million problem, $200 million for those problems. So we are really well positioned to do good things for the next 5 years. So take that.
And Paul, what other agencies are going to be using some of the money?
Dat cap. I would think those are obviously transportation and some of the health, Department of Health has got other things, but Dat cap will be tapping some of that money. But pretty much in our area, the DNR has got most of that money, got control of most of that money. And they have already reached out in a couple different areas and asked us for our opinions and our help. So very good thing.
Yeah,
Well,
and
just
go ahead, friend.
Well, I was going to say, just to layer on that, if you look at both the bipartisan infrastructure bill and then the Inflation Reduction Act, together, as you said, Paul, it also includes DOT, it includes DOA.
Right.
I mean, the list of federal agencies that are administering those funds down to state level agencies is pretty long and broad. And I think one of the sort of alchemy here is to try to direct some of that money that's got different labels on it toward climate related projects. And there will be a lot of opportunity for that.
Yeah. And it's not like we have to bring it up, Fred. I mean, they're ready, willing, and able.
Right. Right.
So I just dropped my email address and Nancy's in here. If you have questions about this work group, ideas, things you'd like to bring up in a next quarterly call, or if you want to, just chat, drop us a note here. And thank you everyone. Thank you for that closing, Paul. I think it's nice to start on hope and go out on a hopeful message. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.